Hello everyone. So this week we're really focusing on mass media, so news media, popular culture, film, television, and really kind of using it as a way to explore how we learn social constructs. And so what we're doing, what we're going to focus on in this lecture is this theory by Edward T. Herman and Noam Chomsky called the propaganda model. And we've talked a bit before about neoliberalism and this idea of that the key to economic growth is a free and unfettered market. So if you can accumulate as much wealth at the top amongst the economic elite that it trickles down to everybody else. And we've talked about how neoliberalism has become kind of normalized as an economic policy and as an economic philosophy. And this has had very real, very kind of extreme outcomes within the structure of media. And so what Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in 1998, they wrote this book called Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media. And so basically what they did is they outlined how media, in particular news media, is a for-profit industry. That it is an industry that its primary concern is to generate profit. And in that, they are able to, quote, manufacture consent for things like war, for example. And in this book, they introduce this theory called the propaganda model that I think is pretty helpful in kind of understanding news media and what we see when we watch the news. And so it's basically this idea that information is presented to us that when before it gets to us, it passes through 5 filters, which all interact with and reinforce each other. And so basically these 5 filters help ensure that the information is presented to us as a dominant narrative of current events. In other words, it's the message of the economic elite. And these 5 filters are concentrated ownership and profit orientation, an advertising-based media system, sourcing mass media news, Flak and the enforcers, and anti-communism as a control mechanism. And Noam Chomsky in a recent interview said that if he could update this, he would update it to anti-terrorism as a control mechanism, that he feels that that terminology is a little more accurate for the present day. So I'm going to go through each of these filters one by one to just explain what they all are and what they mean. So this first filter is the concentration of media ownership and that profit orientation. And what profit orientation means is like what I said earlier, that media is a for-profit industry. And so, and what concentration means, when you're talking about concentration of ownership, we're talking about large numbers of media sources like news stations and television stations and things like that, coming into the ownership of fewer and fewer people. And currently, about 90% of our media is controlled by about 6 corporations. And so the latest numbers I was able to find on this was from 2014. And it's basically these 6 corporations that control about 90% of our media. So Comcast, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. And some of their notable properties that you see there are a lot of these stations that we kind of see as different, right? Like we see MTV and BET as being kind of very different things, but they're both under the ownership of Viacom. We associate ESPN and Pixar being very different things, right? Like ESPN being a sports channel and Pixar being responsible for movies like Shrek and a lot of other computer animated films, right? Those are both owned by Disney. So a lot of these stations that we see as very different are actually under the ownership of the same corporation. And as you'll also see in that chart on the right, that this generates profit in the billions for each of these 6 companies. And so before we continue, I'm going to be using some terminology here, and I kind of want to just clarify what I mean by each of them. And so you're going to hear me talk about things like corporate versus independent versus public forms of media. When I'm talking about corporate, I'm talking about these corporate for-profit driven media sources. So CNN, MSNBC, Fox News are profit oriented. So they're basically those that fall under one of these 6 corporations that I showed you in the previous slide. When I say something like independent or alternative, I'm talking about media sources that do not use corporate or government funds. They're not part of that big 6 that I showed you in the previous slide, but they're also not using any government funds to fund themselves. So one example of an independent media source might be this Democracy Now! And then finally, you have public media. And what public media is media that is publicly funded, and it's usually through tax dollars and other kind of government funds. So National Public Radio, NPR, some of you might listen to on your morning commute, is a public station. PBS, a public broadcasting station, is an example of a publicly funded media. And in the UK, there's the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is actually funded through a television tax that the UK has, that anyone who owns a TV is considered a public utility, so they pay this tax, and it funds the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC. The second filter is advertising-based media system. And so basically what this means is that media sources rely on corporate sponsorship for revenue. So you may notice, lots of commercial breaks during a news segment or during a television program. Those companies are paying to have that ad space there. And so it's basically media in that vein is kind of selling the consumer or the viewer a product, but it also means that they're selling the companies the consumer. So they're selling you to the companies. So it kind of becomes this sort of two-way symbiotic relationship between the media and the companies that provide advertising revenue to them. And the reason that this is an important filter and how information gets disseminated to us is that it can really influence what news sources are willing to report on. Because if they upset one of their sponsors might pull that revenue, and that would mean a financial hardship for the news agency. And so there can be this tendency to emphasize stories that won't upset their sponsors over maybe information that the public really needs to know about. This third filter of the propaganda model is called sourcing mass media news. And it's basically this idea that news is concentrated in bureaucracy-heavy locations. So, for example, if you're a news agency that wants to follow politics very closely, you're going to be really kind of concentrating yourself in Washington, D.C., where the politicians are and where the laws are made, right? And what you see with sourcing mass media news is you see this partnership developing between news sources, news corporations like CNN and MSNBC, for example, with politicians, with large corporations that are in partnership or own those news sources. So you see this kind of growing partnership. You have this thing where information provided by those officials is kind of seen as automatically factual. There's not necessarily a lot of questioning of what those officials say. And you also have this sort of back and forth where things like MSNBC, when Obama was president, would get his speeches before they happened, right? They might get the speeches the night before he was supposed to actually give it to the public. So when you have a relationship like that with people in power, it becomes a lot harder to hold them accountable because you don't want to mess with that relationship. And the other thing that's kind of closely related to sourcing mass media news and how this is really kind of coming to a head today, Sean Spicer and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who both kind of serve in this role as press house secretary. Sean Spicer often kind of passes the mic, so to speak, over to Sarah Huckabee Sanders, is that they've stopped allowing cameras and audio devices in the press conference rooms. And so reporters are now having to listen to these reports from Sean Spicer without any video and without any audio. This increasing partnership between media and politicians has really kind of what's allowed this to happen. And it has real consequences. And even though journalists don't like this isn't quite what they signed up for, this historical precedent of these partnerships with politicians is what's kind of set the stage for this to happen. And so it really kind of influences the information that we get, because we can't actually see it firsthand like we used to be able to. The fourth filter of the propaganda model is this idea of flak to discipline the media. And so flak is basically a negative response to a media statement or program. So, and it's specifically produced by those with the most economic, social, and political power. So basically a journalist reports something on a politician or on a social issue that upsets a sponsor, right? But they report a story that people with the most economic and social and political power didn't want reported. And flak can be direct or indirect. It can be letters or phone calls from government officials, corporate sponsors, to media officials, right? So you report, a journalist reports a very critical story of the mayor of a local city newspaper, right? So say mayor of Seattle, and then this journalist editor gets a call from the mayor's office about the story, and then the editor kind of shuts it down, right? That would be an example of direct flak. An indirect flak is basically when those same people they might complain to their constituencies, they might generate advertisements and campaigns to kind of discredit that person. That would be indirect. You're not kind of going to their superiors, for example, but you're using these other means in order to discredit them and discredit their story. But basically, flak just means a negative backlash to a critical story, a story that is critical of power. And so finally, this last filter, anti-communism and anti-terrorism as a control mechanism, is that it's basically this idea of using fear of a common enemy to influence media messages. So in this context where Herman and Chomsky were writing from, they were writing from communism and the Red Scare. And this idea that communism was to be regarded as the ultimate evil and put anyone with counter-narratives on the defensive. So it basically created a dominant narrative about communism as this ultimate enemy that became very difficult to question without being accused of siding with the enemy. And that's very important, that this idea that if you question the dominant narrative in any way, you are the enemy. And when we're talking about within the frame of communism, many people's careers were actually kind of destroyed by this. This photo on the right is of the Hollywood 10, these are people in the Hollywood industry who were accused of communism, and their lives and careers were really affected by this. Many actors in Hollywood actually saw their careers destroyed by this, whether or not they were actually communists or not. Just the accusation was enough to completely destroy people's lives. And this sort of narrative around communism as the ultimate threat really kind of facilitated this, and the media really played a key role in pushing this at the time. And Chomsky updated this recently to say that it's anti-terrorism that has now taken the mantle of this ultimate enemy, ultimate threat. And he's basically saying that it was reinforced because communism went against corporate interests. So the reason that I want to go through propaganda model as an example of media literacy is because it gets into this idea that media literacy is a practice in intercultural praxis. Because I want you guys to start thinking about how media helps us understand how we learn social constructions of things like race, gender, class, and sexuality. It can be a tool to reinforce a sense of superiority, but can also be a very powerful tool in questioning and challenging the status quo. So I want you to kind of think about what that might look like in various different contexts. And it affects intercultural praxis because it affects how we encounter difference. So with that, please let me know if you have any questions about this lecture. Thank you.